seen the report. My sense is the data that are flowing in are still a little mixed. So I find it hard to say I'm sure the bottom has been hit. And, I'd like to point to the NBER, which is this organization which determines the bottom of US recessions. And usually the NBER determines the bottom 2 years after the bottom has been hit. 2009 was the bottom of the great recession, post-financial crisis. They declared it in 2011. In other words, the data are fuzzy and you never quite know until, in India, CSO will keep revising the data for 2-3 years before it starts getting to something like, and those revisions aren't small. So I would say we won't know, but we will start feeling the data coming together and looking as if it's going in the right direction. My argument repeatedly has been that the economist in India, given the data and the sort of volatility of the data and the fact that we don't necessarily have all the data that we want, has to be in a little bit philosophical. Karma niyamvadikarastu. You do what you can because you know about that. You know what you need to do. That's very clear. But then the outcomes, let that take its course, because you can't really do anything. You never really know. I mean, how can you base policy on a GDP number that changes by 1 to 2 percentage points? That makes the big difference between whether you're above potential or below potential. And we have to determine monetary policy, fiscal policy on that basis. Very hard. I think they're right that, and this is why we have chapter 2, that we have structural problems. We need to solve them. But my sense is that, there's some problems of infrastructure and so on, which will help increase the trend rate of growth. If you have better infrastructure, you have better power, you run less into those kinds of bottlenecks. But I also think that this, skill building, better education, those are also creating sources of bottleneck, which I think if we can alleviate those bottlenecks, they will increase potential growth substantially. My sense is for a country at India's per capita income, this is where China was at the beginning of the 90s, or mid to late 90s. And then it had double-digit growth for 10, 12 years. I don't see why we can't go to that, provided we do the right things. I can say that, well, first the Rabi crop to my mind is going to be stronger, and that will help. It can also help on the inflation front, bring down food inflation. One of the big concerns RBI has is that food inflation is still sticky, even while non-food core inflation is now at a month-to-month of way below 5%. In fact, month-to-month it's more in the region of 2 and 3%. Mm-hmm. So that would suggest that if we can get a handle on food inflation, then we could see an environment in which interest rates could come down more. These are all ifs, but let's see. And if interest rates come down, of course, that creates a lot of incentive both for consumers who are using EMIs to start buying more. Real estate starts picking up, and your car purchases, that also pick up, and finally investment. And our job is to do everything we can to say at least the government is not the constraint here, and things will start picking up. One big downside risk, of course, that we've flagged is the current account deficit. Not so much that it's impossible to finance. I think it is perfectly possible to finance it. And in fact, we have managed to finance a large current account deficit over the last few years with no attrition in reserves. But it does make the country vulnerable to changes in the mood of the international investor. Now, by and large, international investors have stayed by us in times of crisis. So are sort of picking and choosing people to go into the to come to India has worked somewhat in getting a brand of investor. If somebody is willing to go through all the hardship of investing in India, they're fairly dedicated. Maybe we don't want to raise so many hurdles, but clearly we've got people who see India in the long term. But I think increasingly, it does make us vulnerable, and we have to worry about that. The second big factor is oil prices, and I think that oil prices do create another vulnerability if they pop up. Again, the general expectation is they won't, but expectations sometimes get belied. And so, to the extent we can immunize our budget from higher oil prices, we should start trying to think about what those ways might be, including what we're already undertaking, which is passing through the diesel price increases to the consumer. But those are two, I think, important vulnerabilities.